I do want to bring in Josh Hasten, who is the Middle East correspondent for the Jewish News Syndicate. Josh, we do appreciate you taking the time on this Sunday.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
So a lot of folks perhaps may have not turned on the news as they were celebrating their Thanksgiving holiday. So I wanted to ask you if you could just catch up our viewers, especially starting with the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, as of several days ago, Israel and Hezbollah have come to an agreement on a ceasefire. That being said, Israel reserves the right to attack Hezbollah when necessary. On Thursday, there was some movement in southern Lebanon. A Hezbollah perhaps brigade was ready to fire rockets into Israel in violation. So Israel took out those rockets. At the same time, Israel also struck on the Syrian-Lebanese border. Over the weekend, there was activity there with Hezbollah already in the first few days of the ceasefire trying to rearm, trying to bring in weapons from Syria. So Israel reserves the right, even though there is a ceasefire, to go ahead and attack. And I saw the images you were showing before. Ironically, in all this, you see that the Lebanese civilians, they're the ones able to move south back into their homes in southern Lebanon, yet the Israeli civilians, about between 60 and 80,000, forced from their homes on the northern border, they are not allowed to do so. That just shows you how Israel respects ceasefires, but we cannot count on Hezbollah to respect the ceasefire, even for 1 minute.
Yes, and we are sharing that live look in southern Lebanon with our viewers right now as we do see some of that activity continuing. Josh, I did want to ask you this. Could Hamas be more open to a temporary ceasefire because of the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah?
Yeah, Hamas now is sort of isolated, and that was one of the reasons why Israel came to a ceasefire with Hezbollah. But that being said, on Friday, Hamas terrorists in Samaria opened fire on an Israeli passenger bus, wounding 9, including 1 in critical condition. So that's who Hamas is. You can't count on Hamas for anything. Hamas, the same terrorist organization in the 90s and the early 2000s, would blow up buses, blow up Israeli cafes, murdering hundreds of people on a daily basis. So that's who they are. They may say openly, yeah, we're going to soften our positions in terms of a ceasefire. But yesterday, even, they put together a propaganda video, obviously forcing one of those Israeli hostages being held by Hamas, forcing him to use their words and speak complete Hamas propaganda. And they forced him to say, yes, we must have a ceasefire. We must have an exchange of prisoners. You cannot rely on Hamas for a second. They've turned down every ceasefire until now. And even though there are claims right now that they're softening their positions, they're still a maniacal, barbaric terrorist organization. So you have to take anything that Hamas says with a grain of salt.
Absolutely. I do want to also ask you the fact that the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees halting aid deliveries in Gaza because of the armed gangs that have been looting them. You know, what can you share with us about that?
So that's UNRWA, and we know that UNRWA members themselves participated in the October 7th massacre. Hashtag UNRWA is Hamas. That's exactly who they are. So UNRWA, of course, blaming Israel, even though Israel has sent in, I don't know how many tons and tons of aid since the beginning of the war, whether that's justified or not. But UNRWA, for 75 years, continuing to perpetuate the conflict, holding Arab Muslims in Gaza as pawns on the front lines. Why didn't UNRWA assist in getting people out of the battlefield? Why didn't they allow them to go into Egypt, or at least lobby for people in Gaza to go into Egypt? They didn't do that. They're holding them there as pawns, and they're essentially the humanitarian aid of Hamas. So obviously, they're not going to blame Hamas when aid doesn't get where it needs to go. They're going to turn around and blame Israel. You can just go to Twitter and see UNRWA all day long just bashing Israel time and time again. They are not reliable. They've completely botched this operation in terms of humanitarian aid, and then they go and turn and blame Israel for all the problems.
And Josh, really, that is part of the strategy of Hamas, where they are pretty much taking some of the food for their very own Palestinian civilians who they say they're protecting. You know, can you talk about that strategy?
Yeah, time and time again, Hamas hijacks the trucks as soon as they go into Gaza. I mean, I don't know of any other war in the history of the world where you have a country which is turning over humanitarian aid to the civilian population of its enemies in the midst of a war. And that's what Israel's still doing, yet Israel is being bombarded. all the hate and propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda, and a lot of it stems from UNRWA. This is an organization that's supposed to be tasked with resettling refugees and their descendants, which usually isn't the case. It usually stops at the first generation, and in 75 years, they haven't resettled one refugee. Hamas continues to steal the aid. These armed gangs, many of them affiliated with Hamas, just jump on the trucks, hijack the trucks, steal them, use them for themselves and for their own families, while the people of Gaza suffer as a result. So Israel doing everything in its power ever since the beginning of the war, and you might agree that Israel's done too much. But that being said, you have Hamas members and other gangs, terrorist organizations, whether it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, or any of the others, is stealing them for their own personal use. And who's going to go up, unless they want to risk their lives, who's going to go up and try to take on these Hamas armed militias who are stealing all these trucks, stealing all the aid?
Josh, before we let you go, is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So you started off by mentioning the Houthi missile attack. This was a ballistic missile attack this morning. I can tell you exactly when it happened. All of a sudden, 6:21, my phone started going crazy as the red alert siren indicating an incoming missile was activated on my phone. And then I heard the explosions overhead, about 10 to 15 explosions. That's the Israeli interceptor system taking out that missile, which was fired by the Houthis. The Houthis continue to say they will continue to attack Israel. And remember, this is an Iranian-backed terrorist organization. So you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas, you have the Houthis, you have the Iranians themselves. These are all part of the Iranian umbrella of terrorism. Iran is the octopus in all of this with their proxies throughout the Middle East. And they're still striving for nuclear weapons. And we have a new administration coming in Washington in less than 60 days. And the first priority in terms of the situation in the Middle East, both for the sake of the state of Israel and its residents and its citizens, and for the Western world, is dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat. So the Houthis, another branch, literally waking me up this morning at 6:21, launching that ballistic missile here towards Israel. So that's the reality. Israel's still fighting a war on 6 fronts. If you count Hezbollah, that's a 7th front. We'll see how long that ceasefire lasts, if it makes it to that 60-day term. But I think a lot of change is coming with the new administration in Washington.
And Josh, you bring up a good point. The ceasefire is supposed to be for 60 days. Given the current developments, do you feel as though the ceasefire will actually last all 60 days, or do you anticipate changes?
I mean, in theory, Israel could have declared this past Thursday that the ceasefire is over after it detected the Hezbollah terror group there moving weapons into position, perhaps to launch against Israel. So it's very hard to say. It's a fragile ceasefire, but there's no coincidence in the fact that Israel said that they would they were willing to take 60 days. And let's be clear here. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is stating that at any point, if Hezbollah violates, Israel will, in fact, declare the ceasefire over and continue the war. The war is not over. The Prime Minister has made it clear this is not an end to the war, not with Hezbollah, and even if a ceasefire is reached with Hamas, that doesn't signify an end to the war until all the objectives are met, and both of those terror organizations no longer pose a threat to the state of Israel. And in terms of Hamas, we still have to get back the 101 hostages who've been held for over 400 days by this maniacal, brutal terrorist organization, Hamas, which carried out the October 7th massacre.
Josh, as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now.
Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.
You too. And of course, we are